This is about how the battle happened, the fighting itself, the way the soldiers fought, and what it was like for them, and about what the battle meant for the war. The Union was never closer to losing the Civil War than it was in late August of 1862. In 4 months of fighting, rebel armies had won 10 out of 12 battles against the Union, driving Northern armies out of the Shenandoah Valley and away from Richmond, and then moving towards Washington. Political power was shifting in the North towards bargaining for peace. Political pressure was building in England and France to intervene on the South's behalf. Robert E. Lee decided to follow his victory at the Second Battle of Bull Run on August 28th, 29th, and 30th, 1862, with an invasion of Maryland. He wanted to cut the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the link between Washington and the war to the west. He wanted to feed his hungry army from the region's rich farms, and he hoped to prompt Maryland, still a slave state, to join the rebellion. His Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac on September 3rd and headed to Frederick, with some troops moving on the big Union supply depot at Harper's Ferry. From Frederick, he sent more men to attack Harper's Ferry and crossed the range of hills called South Mountain with the rest of his force. Then he split his army again, sending troops to Hagerstown and Harper's Ferry, but leaving some behind to cover the gaps across South Mountain. George B. McClellan and his Army of the Potomac went after Lee 6 days after Lee crossed into Maryland. 30 miles separated Lee's units in Hagerstown and Harper's Ferry. If McClellan could get to Sharpsburg between the scattered commands of Lee's army, he had the chance to overwhelm the rebels in Hagerstown and then drive those in Harper's Ferry south, perhaps all the way to Richmond. With McClellan moving west, Lee ordered his army to gather near Sharpsburg along Antietam Creek. The race was on. Could McClellan get his army to Sharpsburg first? McClellan forced his way through the gaps on September 15th and had his whole army across South Mountain the next day. But Lee won the race. Most of his forces were in Sharpsburg by then, ready for a battle along Antietam Creek. It would come on September 17th. The battlefield was in rolling country between South Mountain on the east and the Potomac River on the west. It was covered in fields and woodlots and crossed with roads and farm lanes. Antietam Creek ran down the middle. There were 3 bridges and 4 fords across it. The road from Boonesboro came in from the east, ran through the town of Sharpsburg and onto the Potomac River and Virginia. The road from Hagerstown came in from the north and carried on to Harper's Ferry. In the battle, the fighting was hardest here at D.R. Miller's cornfield, here along a sunken stretch of road, and here at the lower bridge and across the creek on a low plateau to the west of it. This map covers about 4.5 miles north to south and the same east to west. In big battles, Civil War armies moved in brigades of about 1,500 men, made up of regiments of 300 to 500 men. At first light on September 17th, the North had 42 brigades with 71,500 men on the field, and the South had 23 brigades with 38,000 men. McClellan had his army set for an attack, first down the Hagerstown Pike with 10 brigades, the blue rectangles on the map, and then across the lower bridge with 6 more. He thought Lee had 120,000 men, so he kept strong forces in the center to counter a rebel attack anywhere along his line. Lee had his army in a line defending the road back to Virginia. He was ready for the attack on his left, where he had 9 brigades, the red rectangles, and he stretched his line as far south as he could, covering the lower bridge with a single brigade. Most soldiers on both sides used rifles, mainly the Enfield pattern 1853 for the rebels and the Springfield 1861 for the Union. They were almost 5 feet long and weighed about 9 pounds. To load one, a soldier went through 9 steps. If the soldier did everything right, when he aimed and pulled the trigger, the weapon would go off with a loud bang and a big blast of smoke, and a .58 caliber bullet would go tearing towards the enemy. But in the fear, roar, and smoke of battle, soldiers often made mistakes. In most battles, rifles failed to fire as much as half the time. Barrels got fouled with powder residue, percussion caps failed, or frightened soldiers fumbled the loading process. Only about 5% of the rounds that did get fired hit an enemy soldier. The first fighting took place in Miller's cornfield. It was 30 acres, about 250 yards by 500 yards, of mostly flat land between the east and west woods, with the Hagerstown Pike running along its western edge. This is the view looking across the field towards the east woods. At first light on September 17th, 10 Union brigades were ready to start McClellan's attack on the north end of the battlefield. Facing them, the rebels had only 4 brigades, but they had 7 more nearby. At 6 a.m., the Union troops started their attack. 4 Union brigades came at the cornfield. 2 rebel brigades moved to meet them and took them under fire just as they came through the head-high corn. That stopped the Union advance. Then 2 more Union brigades arrived and forced the rebels to retreat. The 12th Massachusetts was one of the Union regiments in the cornfield. They were fond of singing "John Brown's Body Lies a Mouldering in the Grave" to the tune of an old revivalist hymn. After Julia Ward Howe heard them at it earlier in the war, she changed the lyrics to "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord," giving the Union its greatest battle song. Abolitionist zeal, hard combat earlier in the war, and determined courage were no match for what the regimental history called the most deadly fire of the war. In a few minutes of fighting, 224 out of 334 Massachusetts men went down. At 67%, that was the highest casualty rate of any Union regiment in the battle. 2 Union brigades hit 2 rebel brigades along the pike and drove them back into the west woods. A 3rd rebel brigade got into the fight and brought the Union attack there to a halt. Then 2 more rebel brigades counterattacked and drove the Union troops out of the cornfield. 2 Union brigades counterattacked in turn. Caught in fire from 3 sides, the rebels in the cornfield were shot apart. One of their regiments lost 80% of its men. When asked where his men were, the rebel commander replied, "Dead on the field." These are Confederate dead along the edge of the cornfield. The fight for the cornfield was a battering head-on battle, with brigades slamming into each other at close range for 3 hours. A Union soldier who survived it said, "It was a great tumbling together of heaven and earth. The slaughter on both sides was enormous." He was right. Nearly 8,000 men were wounded or killed in the battle for the cornfield. By 9 a.m., it was over. The Confederates had pulled back from the cornfield, and they had just 4 brigades in or near the west woods. Almost all the Union brigades had pulled back to the north, leaving scattered units in the woods and cornfield and 2 brigades near the Dunker Church. Through the rest of the morning and into the early afternoon, there was a struggle for the west woods. 3 more Union brigades broke into the woods, and the Confederates brought up 7 brigades to drive them out. Another Confederate brigade tried to push the Union troops away from the Dunker Church, but failed. Lee caught one of his soldiers there, heading away from the battle with a captured pig under his arm. Lee took the pig, put the man under arrest, and sent him back to his commander to be shot as an example to the army. Instead, the man went back into the line and fought so bravely he got a pardon. One of Lee's aides said, "Though the soldier lost his pig, He saved his bacon. Then the fighting in this part of the battlefield rattled to an end, with both sides worn down too far to fight any more. Among the Union wounded in the West Woods was Captain Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr., future U.S. Supreme Court Justice. Hard fighting began in the open fields along the sunken road at the center of the battlefield around 9 a.m. On both sides, infantry fought on line, with the men standing about half an arm's length apart in two rows, one behind the other. Battle flags marked the center of each regiment's line. To keep the line together, brigades moved towards the enemy at a walk. Soldiers took cover behind trees, rocks, and fences, or in low ground. When they couldn't find cover, they crouched to take enemy fire. But that made it harder to load their rifles and slowed their rate of fire, so in a big fight, they stood to fire even though it made them bigger targets. One Union soldier said he felt as large as a good-sized barn and consequently very likely to take in all the balls, shells, grape, and canister coming in my direction. Most firefights happened at ranges of 100 yards or even less. The first few volleys did most of the damage. After that, thick clouds of smoke from all the rifles firing made it hard to see the enemy, and more weapons misfired. This is the sunken road looking south. The Union attack came in from the left through open fields planted with clover and corn and over a low rise that peaked about 50 to 100 yards in front of the road. At 9 a.m., the Union brigades near the Dunker Church attacked into the woods, and 3 Union brigades moved past them to attack the western end of the sunken road. At first, there were only about 3 rebel brigades to hold against them. 4 more rebel brigades filled in to the east just before an attack by 2 more Union brigades. The Union troops came over the rise, target sharp against the eastern sky, as historian Shelby Foote puts it. From down in the road, the rebel fire brought them to a dead stop. Then the 2 sides traded volleys, but not for long. The soldiers on both sides went into battle with only about 50 rounds of ammunition, and resupply along the front was haphazard, so no one could keep up a high rate of fire for more than 10 minutes or so. The Union brigades moved back behind the rise for cover, advancing men from time to time over the crest to shoot quickly and then pull back. The 2 sides fired at one another for 3.5 hours until the rebels broke and scrambled back towards Sharpsburg. That left the center of Lee's line wide open. But, afraid of being outnumbered, McClellan ordered his troops not to move through the gap towards Sharpsburg, an undefended mile away. For rebels caught in it, the sunken road turned from a shelter to a slaughter pen. This is a picture taken a day or 2 after the battle. Shelby Foote described it this way, as if they had tumbled headlong by the hundreds out of the sky. Dead men filled whole stretches of the road to overflowing. Union and rebel casualties in this fight came to 5,600 men. Artillery was an important weapon, especially in the cornfield fight, at the lower bridge, and near Sharpsburg. Soldiers called cannons guns. The Union had 300 guns at Antietam. The rebels had 230. Both sides used the same kinds of guns. The Napoleon was a smoothbore cannon, ideal for closer combat with enemy infantry. The Parrott had a rifled bore, which gave it greater range and made it better for dueling with enemy artillery. Artillery fought in units called batteries, with 4 guns in a Confederate battery and 6 in a Federal one. Each gun was attached to an ammunition chest on wheels called a limber and was pulled by 6 horses. They were very mobile. A battery could unlimber and start firing in a minute, fire 2 rounds a minute, and limber up and move out in another minute. 3 to 4 batteries had the combat power of an infantry brigade. They attacked at a distance using solid shot or exploding shells. Close up, within 300 yards, they used canister shot, filled with iron balls that turned a cannon into a giant shotgun. But when enemy infantry got within 200 yards of an artillery battery, it had to pull back, or rifle fire would kill the gunners and the horses and put the guns out of action. Around 11 a.m., Union soldiers, commanded by Ambrose Burnside, tried to cross the lower bridge, seen here from the east bank of Antietam Creek, the Union side. At the far end of the bridge on the rebel side, there was a steep bluff topped with a stone wall. At the bridge, the creek ran about 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep, too deep to wade across under fire. This elegant span, 125 feet long and 12 feet wide, was the only way for a big attack to go in against the southern end of Lee's line. There were 6 Union brigades ready to force their way over the bridge. The rebels had 1 small brigade on the bluffs above it and 4 more back near Sharpsburg. The Union attack started when 1 regiment tried to wade the creek but was driven back by heavy fire from the bluffs above the bridge. Another Union brigade sent in 2 regiments in a long column, 4 men wide, to fit across the bridge. They met with the same fierce rebel fire and took big losses before falling back. The Union brought up artillery to help with the attack, and just past noon, another brigade moved down towards the bridge. This time, instead of trying to take the bridge in a rush, the Union soldiers spread out on either side of it, sheltering behind a rail fence and the stone wall you saw in the photo, and opened fire. One of them wrote home, "The way we showered the lead across that creek was nobody's business." The fire from the Union artillery and infantry was too much for the rebels. They pulled back off the bluff, and Burnside got his bridge. By 3 p.m., the Federals had 8 brigades on the Confederate side of the creek. The 79th New York Regiment was one of them. They called themselves the Highlanders and reported for duty at the start of the war in kilts. They had to be forced at gunpoint to give them up. At Antietam, they wore the standard uniform trousers. The Confederates had 4 brigades and 40 cannons defending Sharpsburg and the southern end of their line. 4 Union brigades attacked them and slowly drove them back. The 2 brigades in front of Sharpsburg held out for an hour and a half and then scattered back through the town. At the same time, the 2 brigades at the end of the Confederate line broke and ran, after trading volleys with Union troops at 50 yards and then fighting close in with bayonets and rifle butts, something that was very rare during the war. Just then, 6 more Confederate brigades joined the battle after a 17-mile, 8-hour march from Harper's Ferry. Their attack forced the Federals back towards the bridge. The heavy fighting was over by 5 p.m., and the last of the firing died down after sunset, around 6 p.m. None too soon for a Union soldier who wrote, "The sun almost seemed to go backwards, and it appeared as if night would never come." Losses on both sides in the fighting at the Burnside Bridge and across the fields near Sharpsburg amounted to 4,000 men. Soldiers hit in the head or torso rarely lived, but most men hit in the arms or legs survived. Comrades or soldiers in the medical service picked up wounded soldiers on the battlefield and brought them to field hospitals. This is a picture of a Confederate one at Antietam. Doctors treated the wounded. Surgery was done under anesthesia. Amputations were 75% of operations, and 75% of amputees survived. Wounded men went on by wagon and rail to general hospitals in Washington, Richmond, and elsewhere, where the care was good, with mortality rates under 10%. Men were not the only casualties at Antietam. There were 11,000 horses on the battlefield with the artillery of both sides. Hundreds were killed, like this horse, dead beside the ruined limber it had been pulling. After the battle, dead horses were gathered into piles and burned. For dead soldiers, the battle ended in a hasty grave with a piece of board for a marker. You can just make out 10 of them up against the stone wall near the Burnside Bridge. 600,000 more men would find their own graves before the war ended, but never so many on a single day in this war or any other that America has fought. This is the butcher's bill. Total casualties for both sides were 22,720. 3,650 men died, except for September 8, 1900, when a hurricane hit Galveston and as many as 12,000 people died. It was the deadliest day in American history. Here is where the two armies were at the end of the day on September 17th. The Union brigades from the battles in the cornfield and the West Woods were regrouping off to the north. A strong line held in the center and on the west side of the Burnside Bridge, and there were more brigades back in reserve. The Confederates were in a line that wound from the Potomac to Antietam Creek, with a big reserve near Sharpsburg. They expected the battle to start up again on the next day. An old slave woman asked a rebel soldier in Sharpsburg, "Did you have a hard fight today?" He replied, "Yes, Auntie, the Yankees gave us the devil this day, and they'll give us hell next." But there was no more fighting. Lee stood his ground on September 18th to gain time to get his wounded across the Potomac, and McClellan let him alone. Lee took his army south during the night. McClellan waited more than a month to go after him, and for that, Lincoln fired him. As always, McClellan was more afraid of defeat than he was eager for victory. He fought a hesitant, disjointed battle, missing his chance to storm into Sharpsburg after he broke Lee's line at the Sunken Road, and sending in one attack after another instead of hitting Lee hard at both ends of his line at once. As always, Lee was spoiling for a fight. He fought a skillful battle, making the most of the terrain and feeding batteries and brigades into the fight at the right place and time. But he was reckless. Giving battle badly outnumbered and backed up against a river, he risked not just defeat, but destruction of his irreplaceable army. Antietam was the first time a Union army forced Lee to retreat, but it did little enough to end the war. It would take 2.5 years more of hard fighting to bring Lee down and put an end to the rebellion. The real winners from Antietam were the country's slaves. Abraham Lincoln told his cabinet, "I made a solemn vow before God that if General Lee was driven back from Pennsylvania, I would crown the result by the declaration of freedom to the slaves." 5 days after the battle, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, changing the war into a fight not just for Union, but also for freedom. Antietam is the battle that gave the war its best meaning.